Recently, Piers Morgan had a woman by the name of Janet Mock on the program. She's a transgender activist, and she is promoting a book that she has written called Redefining Realness. Now, the transgender issue is really important to talk about, so I was happy to see that Piers Morgan was having an activist on his program to talk about it, but some are questioning the way he handled the interview. Take a quick look.
So this is the amazing thing about you. Had I not known anything about your story, I would have had absolutely not a clue that you had ever been a boy, a male. Mm-hmm. Which makes me absolutely believe you should always have been a woman. And that must have been what you felt when you were young. Did you ever feel like, say, I can't deal with this, I'm going to have to go back to being a boy, Charles? At what point did you change your name? Here you go. This takes a lot of courage, this. You're going through school. You've gone from Charles to Janet, from boys' clothes to girls' clothes. And you've coped with all the teasing and the bullying. You've come through, and it's made you, I guess, strong in your head enough to say, I'm going to go through properly with this and become a woman. I'm going to have a transgender operation, which is a huge thing to do at 18. Tell me how you felt when you actually were approaching the operation. What was the moment after you had it, when you looked in the mirror and were finally able to think, wow, that is who I'm supposed to be?
So as you can tell, a lot of the questions focused on her transition from male to female, and people are really upset about that. So Janet Mock did write about the interview after it happened, and she said the following: "They're not talking about my advocacy or anything like that. It's just about this sensationalized meme of discussion of trans women's lives. We're not real women, so therefore, if we're in relationships with men, we're deceiving them. So it just feeds into the same kinds of myths and fears that they spread around, which leads to further violence of trans women's bodies and identities." Yep. So I think that she makes a really interesting point there, and I'm going to say something controversial. I don't disagree with Piers Morgan's questions. I don't find anything wrong with the questions he asked. However, I don't like the emphasis on that part of the discussion as opposed to some of the struggles that transgender individuals face in the country right now. You know, talk about the unemployment rate among them, talk about the violence that they face, talk about some of the inequalities that they have to deal with day in and day out, and how hard that struggle really is. It's important to discuss that. However, I think that you start getting into really, really shaky territory when you tell a reporter or a journalist or a host that he or she can or cannot ask certain questions.
Yeah, that's true. Look, we definitely have higher expectations of people in the media, like, you know, Piers Morgan, for instance. We expect him to know about a lot of things on a not just on a shallow level, on a deep level. But if he brought her on and said, I'm going to ask you about your activism, and then instead asked about the transition, I totally understand that that's incredibly frustrating and in some ways perhaps insulting. But considering that he seems incredibly supportive there, the simple fact that he's asking the questions, I think that there is a level of sensitivity at which, like, you're asking too much of the man. And the reason I say that is because if you're a part of a very small minority group, for instance, you live that struggle your entire life and you understand it many layers deeper than anyone else who's not a part of it could possibly understand. But then to expect another person who comes at you in their version of somewhat ignorant support to understand the struggle in the same way that you do, how could they possibly understand that?
Yeah, and I think
so you have to be diplomatic, you have to be willing to help them to understand.
And you also have to keep in mind that a lot of Americans are very, very ignorant about the transgender community, right? They don't understand it. And I think that a lot of the violence and a lot of the bigotry toward that community stems from that ignorance. So they don't understand what goes through the mind of someone who wants to go through a sex change operation. Yeah. So I think it is important for a reporter to ask that question, right? Because people think that it's a lifestyle choice, which of course it's not. It's more about gender identity. It's the fact that you identify with a particular gender, but you're trapped in the body of a different gender. Yeah. And explaining that and talking about that is extremely important. Now, if Piers Morgan was asking questions that were super degrading, like, oh, like, what's your sex life like? Like, well, you know,
exactly. He didn't do anything like that. No. I thought from the headline that's what he did.
Yeah.
But those are perfectly reasonable questions.
I didn't like the lower third that they had. The lower third said something like, was born a boy or was a boy until 18, and that lower third just seemed a little
That just shows that they
insensitive.
don't really understand. Look, we sometimes have lower thirds that are a little bit offensive.
Yeah,
but
I know.
that's their level of understanding, and you, by being on the show, have a perfect opportunity to clue them into what they should have there. That's a part of the advocacy, I would imagine.
And as a guest on the show, I mean, I think that it's important to always keep in mind that you have the ability to change the topic. So if you're uncomfortable with that line of questioning and you want to focus on your advocacy work or you want to focus on your book, you have the ability to do that. You know, I think that there's a little bit of a power struggle when you have a host interviewing a guest, but go in there and be like, you know what, we had enough discussion about my sex change or whatever it is, my transition, I should say. Why don't we talk about what's really happening with this community, because that's the real issue at hand. Now, I did not like the way Piers Morgan responded to the criticism. I think that he came out as extremely defensive and a little offensive. He says, so I try to highlight Janet Mock's inspiring story, and she and her supporters respond by trashing me. Really disgusting. I'll deal with you tomorrow night on air, Janet Mock. Never been treated in such a disgraceful manner. Be proud. Wow. I mean,
okay, that's a couple layers. Dial it down.
Yeah, that was
Dial it
not,
down.
That
You're
was
out of 10,
not,
you need to be at a 2.
That was not appropriate.
Yeah, I understand his frustration on a much lower level than that, because I know sometimes when we've been talked about, when we've talked about stories like this, I've gotten extremely hateful messages, and I feel like I'm probably in a similar position as Piers Morgan. If I feel like I want to learn about a group and I'm supportive of their political goals, to then be attacked because I don't have like a PhD level of knowledge about it, that seems in some ways worse than being attacked by your clear enemies, because you expect, like, I'm with you, I feel like I'm with you, and so I understand that, but man, he went too far. But that's how Piers Morgan is, man.
That is how
I like his interviews sometimes, but he does not pull punches when it comes to the online stuff like Twitter.
Don't send her a threat like,
And disgusting.
I'll deal with you tomorrow.
Yeah, no, and that again gets into the power dynamic
Yeah.
that you were talking about. Like, you're a freaking host, man. You don't need to be attacking this woman. She doesn't have, as far as I know, a show where she can then counterattack you.